To order. Okay, so this is Parashar Patel, Chair of this Finance Committee Subcommittee Guideline Subcommittee. I'm going to call the meeting to order. I'm going to go around the video screens here. Chris?
Present.
Parashar, present. Kathy?
Here.
Ray?
Here.
Peggy?
Here.
Dee?
Present.
Mary?
Here.
Lois?
Here.
And Dean?
Here.
All right, we do have a quorum. Let us get started. I know 3 members have said either, well, one person said, Amrith said that he can't attend, and Eric and Greg are going to be late. So let's get started. We've got a quorum. Our goal today is to approve preliminary guidelines for fiscal year 2023. I can't stress the word preliminary enough, given where we are, and Kerry will talk a little bit about revenue estimates. We will be, just to remind folks, we will issue final guidelines in December, but the preliminary guidelines at this point will provide an opportunity both to the schools and the town to get a sense of the committee in terms of where we think the fiscal year 2023 budgets ought to come out. I'm sure that they'll take preliminary guidelines plus our comments the last 2 sessions in terms of strategic priorities, et cetera, into account as they think about the fiscal year 2023 budget. I'd like to start today with an update to the 5-year projections. If you recall, the last meeting we had 5-year cost projections from the town and the schools. We've updated those. I'll quickly walk through those, identify some of the major changes that took place to provide that overall context in terms of where spending is going over a 5-year horizon. Then what I'd like to do is share a potential preliminary guideline approach, sort of thinking about it as a bottoms-up approach with the committee. And then I'll turn it over to Kerry for her to walk through where the revenue estimates are coming out, given that we're 3 months into the current fiscal year. And then after that, I think what I'd like to do is open it up for discussion, go around the committee, see what folks' feelings are around a preliminary guideline set of numbers, discussion and a vote. I'd like to be able to do all of that in 60 minutes. Hopefully, I'm sure we can get through it. And on the questions, if you have questions, if something's unclear as either I'm presenting or Kerry, feel free to interrupt and ask a question for clarity's sake. But let's hold off on the discussion if we can until we get through the presentations, and then we could have a robust discussion around the numbers and the good potential guidelines. Before I get started, any other questions or thoughts? Mary or Chris, any thoughts? Okay, good. Let me share my screen. Let's see, I should be able to do this. Hopefully it works out, and let's see here. Did that work out? Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me put it into presentation mode here. We don't have to squint. Okay. So just a quick roadmap, right? Let's start with the 5-year cost projection. So the next set of slides you're going to see a similar format. So I'll just orient you to the format. What we have here are fiscal year 2022 estimates, and then 23 to 27 are cost projections. Fiscal year 23 number should not be taken as a request at this point. But you can see the major categories that Kerry prepared for us. And you can see under each category, the annual growth, and over on the right-hand side, 5-year CAGR from 23 to 27. These numbers really haven't changed since the tentative spreadsheet I shared the other day. And I will circulate this PowerPoint with it for everybody as well. And if folks are interested in the Excel calculations, happy to share those as well. The G on the left-hand side basically marks those categories that are included in guideline spending, right? And so for the town, things like benefits, retirement, OPEB, and debt are not included. Tier 2 and Tier 3 debt are not included in guidelines. And so you can,
Can I
Yep.
interrupt for just a second? So the debt, the exempt debt tier 3, that line does not include the middle school, is that correct?
Yeah, that is
Obviously.
correct. Thank you. So
Okay, just wanted to
nothing we
clarify.
talk about today will account for the middle school.
Okay,
Okay?
Yep.
And you can see estimated spending for fiscal year 2022 right now is about $53.1 million going out over 27 to 63.2, about a 3.1% annual increase. Okay. One other thing, you'll see here a note at the bottom. This is spending for money coming out of the general revenue funds only. It does not include enterprise funds. Okay. So 5-year cost projection, similar layout for Concord Public Schools. The box circles those categories which are new. They were not available last time we met. And you can see it's basically special ed tuition, some early retirement buyback, and other expense category, we just sort of lumped into other basically. The entire line item here, all of the line items, $41.7 million is included in guideline spending. And you can see the growth goes from 41.7 to 50.1, 3.8%, again, estimated growth. And, and again, similar to what we have for the town, it does not include $4.6 million worth of spending for fiscal year 2022 expenses, which come from grants, revolving accounts, and gift accounts of the like. Okay. And then we have 5-year cost projections for Concord Carlisle High School. This is the Concord share. And similarly, you can see most of the spending is included in guideline spending. The totals, by the way, for each of these tables include all spending. And you're going to see when we get to the guideline section, you're going to see the total guideline spending as well. But just like what we saw for CPS, the categories within the squares are new relative to what we displayed last time. The interesting piece, and I know Jared's on the phone and Lori's on the phone as well, and they can provide a little bit more detail, but even though we added over $2 million worth of new spending, even though it wasn't new to the Concord share, overall Concord share remained relatively what it was previously, because apparently Carlisle's share of total spending for CCHS actually will be going up. I think there was some issues with calculations when we had the numbers last time. So kind of good news for us, not so good news for Carlisle. One of the factors driving that, I think, and Jared, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Lori, the Concord share of enrollment for the high school goes from 77.32%, is projected to go down to about 74.8%. I don't know how much of that is driving that shift. There may be other factors as well. Lori or Jared, do you want to just provide 30 seconds of commentary there now? And we can always provide more detail if the committee wants at a later stage.
Sure, I give you just a really quick overview. The Concord enrollment has a slow decline to it. Carlisle has had a decline and now is rebounding from that decline. And it's the combination of the two that really creates that situation.
Okay, Dean, you had a question?
Simple question. Whoops, I might be on mute. Hold on.
No, you're not.
Oh,
You're
I'm
not on
not.
mute.
Okay. Simple question, and it's really mostly for the rest of the committee. Would like to just get this information out there. The way in which this is done is each year we just take the previous year and we reallocate based on those numbers. Is there any progress being made towards a more smooth approach, like a 3 or a 5 year moving average to that, which would lessen the impacts of year over year changes?
The short answer is the school committee is not looking at the regional agreement right now. I don't hear of a plan to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks,
Welcome.
Dean. Thanks, Lori. And then just like what you saw for CPS, the bottom line number doesn't include about $3.6 million in fiscal year 22 spending, again, from grants, revolving accounts, et cetera. Okay. So hopefully that gives folks, a pretty good picture of where spending projections are going. Again, probably a little bit less faith, like for many long-term projections on years 4 and 5, reasonable confidence on 23, 24, 25, particularly because some of these costs like salaries and benefits are fixed for a whole set of reasons. Okay. So let's now turn to the potential preliminary guidelines. And as I said, what we have here is a summary of one approach I thought might be useful, what I'm calling a bottom-up approach, if you will. And if we go with a bottom-up approach like that, using the assumptions that you see on the right-hand side, this provides a summary of what the results look like. I'm going to walk you through the assumptions used here at a high level. You can see the comparison to the SGR that we had back in July. And then for each of the units, I'm going to walk you through the specific calculations of how we get to 3.06, 3.188, et cetera, right? And so what the approach I took as a potential approach is take the fiscal year 22 guideline spending estimate for each budget unit, look at the different components, and use the assumptions on the right-hand side that the Congressional Budget Office made in July of what inflation, employment costs would grow like in state fiscal year 2023, basically, right? And this is, if you remember, we had a discussion back in the summertime, nonpartisan congressional office, that does projections twice a year, macroeconomic projections. That's what we're using here. These are national CPI numbers, National Employment Cost Index, very hard to get down, if you will, to regional from a consistent source. And then on the health insurance side, CBO hasn't published their health insurance health spending model. I use Medicare CMS. They have a projection of private health spending. I use that for theirs is for calendar year 2023, but given a lot of benefits are based on calendar years, thought that was the most appropriate. Dean, question?
Clarification on the employment cost index. Does that include, is it an all-in cost for employees? Meaning, does it include healthcare, or is it just a salary? Is it a salary cost index?
It's salary, wages and salaries.
Wages and salaries. So it does not include any benefit package that would be in addition to wages and salaries.
That is correct.
Okay, thanks.
So, okay. And again, for reference, 2.34% sustainable growth rate calculated according to the methodology that we've used the past couple of years. Okay. Let me break each of these down for
Hey,
folks.
Parashar,
Yeah.
I just have a question. So we're using the word estimate on the FY22. That's the budget, right? Those are the budget for the spending guideline categories, right?
I'm gonna turn it to Carrie and Jared just to clarify that. My understanding was it was an estimate of the current spending.
So for the, I'll start, CPS in the high school, that CPS is our budget. In the high school, that is our operating budget. So that does not include debt.
Okay. And Carrie, for the town, those are budget, that's a summary of spending guideline category budget for FY22. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I stand corrected. So those are budgets. So they may be actually a little bit high, if you will, as a base, if we want to go off of the go off actuals as we get closer to December estimates. Okay, so the town breakdown looks like this basically. So we had a personnel line, $22.2 million. Again, using the employment cost index. And, to Dean's point, on the guidelines, at least for the town, it includes salaries, right? And so the benefits and everything else are outside guideline spending. So 3.4 is probably the closest approximation, if you will. And you can see the math here. I won't walk everyone through the math. And then on the expenses side, which includes supplies, equipment, tier one spending, et cetera, growing that about 2.2%, using the CPIU chain weighted. And those that are not familiar with the concept of chain weighting, what economists do is they basically say, well, we know that if the price of some goods increases more than people want to pay, they'll substitute other goods that are just, maybe not exactly equivalent, but good enough. And therefore, the inflation, when you calculate it using that substitute behavior, tends to be slightly lower than if you just assume that they keep buying the same basket of goods over time. And so basically, that's the 2.2 CPIU chain weighted number that you see there. You add them together, and the total would be a 3.1% increase, if you will, in the guidelines. Let me pause here. Peggy, you've got a question?
Yes, I'm sorry. Does the expenditure estimate, does that include the 1 million? That's and so for the police cars and that sort of thing that we looked at in a previous meeting, the 7 million.
Carrie?
So the 7 million number does assume that the capital outlay spending is at $2 million, which is at the bottom of the policy. So it would include cruisers.
It would have included those cruises, but what it doesn't
But not-
include,
but-
Well,
But
that was, I'm sorry, so there was a $1 million number and that's included in the 7 million.
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you.
but, and I guess a related point is, if you remember for fiscal year 2022, as Carrie said, the town scaled back tier one purchasing to the minimum level. If you bring it back to sort of historical levels, you'd add in another $1 million to the 7.1 basically. And so for what I'm showing here, I didn't add that $1 million back in. Does that make sense?
Parashar, I think you actually did, because the expense, if you go back to the town, I don't know that you want to, but the town, you can see the expense, the tier one, the second down, that up in, oh, I'm sorry, you're looking at fiscal 22. So fiscal 22 includes 800,000 for tier one. Fiscal 23 includes 2 million.
So and I didn't add that $1 million back in. Okay. Peggy, is that clear?
Yes, thank you.
Yep. Okay. Any other questions before we go to CPS?
Yep, Parashar, I'm sorry, I didn't follow that. Can you just run that by me one more time, please?
Yeah, so let me go backwards. Probably easiest to just look at this. So, okay, freeze. So if you look at the expenses line, says includes tier one, you see the fiscal year 2022 number of 7.1 million. Last year, because of COVID, the town actually didn't spend tier one, didn't spend as much money on tier one as it historically has. They scaled it back by about $1 million. So if COVID hadn't happened and everything else had been equal, that 7.1 probably would have been closer to 8.1 or 8.2, right? And so when Carrie developed the cost projections, just like we asked her to, hey, kind of assume, make your assumptions about what you think is going to look like, you can see that the expense line goes from 7.1 to 8.5. And Carrie said, well, I'm bringing it back to pre-COVID levels, basically, in the cost, right? Now, when I calculated the guideline, or at least, said, what should we use for a guideline expense? I'm not adding the $1 million back into the 7.1. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's what's going on. Okay.
Okay, so I'm sorry. So that was the opposite of what you earlier said to me, to my question. The 7.1 And the 2.2% does not include that 1 million extra.
It does not, no.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. Okay,
Okay. CPS, similar approach. I'll walk you through the categories for those, for the items that are in the guidelines. I kind of rolled up some of these numbers here from the previous rows just for clarity's sake. And you can see the personnel special going at 3.4. Special ed tuition was a tough one, but I'm assuming rightly, wrongly, for this purpose, probably involves a lot of teachers. So I thought maybe the employment cost index was probably an appropriate number. And, you know, to Dean's point, there's no real national projection from CBO around retirement or sick leave, that sort of stuff. So I just, again, use the employment cost index as a proxy. And then on the expenses side, again, the 2.2, you can see the roll up there going from about 4.7, adding in about 1.3 million gets us to 43 at a rate of about 3.2%. Okay. And then a similar approach for CCHS. And again, personnel 3.4. And Dean, the insurance line is almost all health insurance. And that's where because the 3.4 isn't reflective of health insurance benefits in particular. And so let's see what CMS is saying about projections for private healthcare spending per capita. And again, this is per capita. The 1.4 is a total, but again, as a proxy, I thought might be useful to just plug that in there. Basically, won't go through the rest of the lines per se, but use total guideline number. Basically, this calculates, it rolls up to 3.1%, basically.
So vis-a-vis that estimate,
Yeah.
just to be crisp about that, I think that the CMS group participates in the same, that can be applied to the town. That's really the town's number for CMS. But does the CCHS participate in the same healthcare regional system that the town participates in? Just to be
Yes.
They
Yes,
do.
they do. Yep.
Thanks.
Just a real quick question around special ed. Why is it not a line item for the CCHS here? Do we not have an estimate there, or am I not thinking about this correctly? Like, I would assume that there's some special ed considerations at the high school level too. Is that correct? Or am I thinking about this completely wrong?
There are, for sure.
Is that not on the sheet?
No, and I don't want to complicate it. So sorry, Parshar, can you go forward?
Yep.
To the CPS? We just covered CPS guideline. That made sense. You had the special ed tuition. I'm just wondering if there's a special ed tuition consideration at CCHS. I'm just trying to understand that.
Jared, did it roll up into one of the other categories?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it did. Yeah.
No. Well, in the sheet that I did, we have about 1.5 million.
Maybe it was just the transposition of the numbers.
And then the number I gave for Concord is about 1.6 million. So it's probably, Parashar, it's probably.
Brian, we'll take it under consideration. I'll take a look at it with Jared and we'll revise the tables if we have to.
Yeah.
I
It's
think it
898. It's in the table I gave. Oh, yeah, right there, special ed tuition.
That's CPS, Jared.
That's CPS. I was just curious to know if some of these line items, I would presume that you guys are taking that into account at the high school as well. So I was just wondering if it gets rolled up into another line, or should we just sort of have an explicit understanding of that as well? Because you guys highlighted it at CPS. It's not highlighted here.
It's weird. It's highlighted on my sheet, and I missed Parashar's. I'll have an answer in about 2 seconds because I have it broken out on my sheet.
Let's do this, Jared.
No worries.
We don't have an answer now. Brian, will come back to you in the committee on an answer. Okay. I don't want to pop out of here just to clarify that. So we'll get an answer to that. Okay. So you can see the 21.36 rolls up to 3.122 million dollars. Okay. So now, if we take the previous numbers we just walked through, and you plug them into Carrie's financial, the fiscal year 23 guideline model. For those of you that are new to the committee, and frankly, even for myself, the gray here is just an input from the guideline spending we just walked through. If you take the numbers in terms of the increment that we just walked through, you come up with a total of $2.9 million. And you can see the total guidelines 95. To help you understand the tax impact of that, Carrie nicely has a table down below, and you can see 3.14, match it up to the closest row here, 3.15, and you can see the tax impact both on the unused levy and the increase to the base of 3.27. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, because the guideline model and the impact on taxes depends a lot, both not only on the spending, but also on the revenue from other sources. So I think it's important just to keep that in mind. Right now, we're at a very preliminary stage. Carrie's going to walk us through now where we stand with revenue, where we stand with free cash, et cetera. And then she'll pull up the actual spreadsheet model. So if we want to start having a discussion and modeling different numbers for guidelines, we can do that. So the committee gets comfortable with, again, a preliminary number that we can share with the towns and the schools. Does that make sense? Before I turn it over to Carrie, any other questions on potential approach here?
Parrish, we're sure the sped number got rolled into the expense category. So it's there. It's just not broken out the same way.
Yeah, it looks like it's in the other, but all the numbers add up. So.
Okay, thank you.
And I can break that out for you, Brian, too.
Okay, Peggy?
Yeah, I'm just also looking at, we don't have page numbers, but on page 3, it looked like the property tax calculation was 5%. And it's much different, and now it's,
I'm sorry.
this number is quite different. No, keep going back. The first,
Peggy's looking at the ask for 23, Parashar.
Oh, I see.
It's not technically the ask, but it's what the
Oh,
projection was.
you're looking at, oh, I see. Are you looking at this number 5.4?
yes, I am.
Okay, so that's not the proper, that has, so Peggy, that's not anything about property tax. What the cost projections show for the town and the schools is their estimate of what spending it might grow like, will grow like, right?
Yeah.
And so they simply rolled up what they project spending could increase fiscal year 23
Yeah.
without any pressure testing, trade-offs or anything else.
No, that's, I'm sorry, that's not the number. Go back to the third, it's not page numbers, but the third page had the tax impact at 4.5.
What's the title? This is the first page, second, third.
What's it, okay,
Are you
I
looking at
apologize, I will, I will back off and try to find the page I was looking at.
Okay, I think it might be in Carrie's presentation. So let me
Yeah,
turn it over to,
okay.
let me turn it over to Carrie. She's gonna provide an update on current revenue estimates. And then, as I said, we'll start a discussion about what we think a preliminary guideline on number could look like. Carrie, if you're speaking, you're on mute. No, Carrie, you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. For some reason, I couldn't unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So So we'll take a quick look at revenue. And this is just all of our revenue together. We have our 4 categories of revenue: property tax, state aid, local receipts, and then at the bottom, that's the available fund or available funds or all other financing sources. So in terms of property taxes, the first assumption that we make going into guidelines is that we're going to hold the unused levy capacity at the same percentage as it is in the current year. So right now, we just had our new growth certified, and it is just a little bit higher than what we're showing you here this evening. But based on that certified new growth for fiscal 22, the unused levy capacity is going to be 5.05%. So our first assumption on property tax is to hold at 5.05% unused levy capacity. The other assumption that we're making right now is for new growth. And our new growth assumption right now is $800,000. Now it was just certified at $970,000 for fiscal 22. It was $957,000 in fiscal 21. So you may wonder why we're going a little bit lower at 800,000, but it's really early. We need to make an assumption now for the value of new growth as of June 30, 2022. And with all of the uncertainties with the supply chain issues, we can't really make the same kind of projections that we have in prior years. So we're going a little low, and we hope that that's going to increase, that we'll be able to increase that as we move through the budget process. And then we add in our excluded debt, and that's actually projected to go down by $353,000 because we're paying off the middle school. Now the elementary schools. That may go up if we start adding the additional spending for middle school, but right now nothing is approved, and so we're not adding anything in. The next category of aid is state aid. And for those of you who have been through this process a few times, you know that the state is not preparing its budget on the same timetable as the town. We won't know anything about the state budget until the end of January. And we don't typically have a state budget approved until the end of May. Fortunately for us, state aid is only about $6 million of our budget. And so it's not a significant portion. And so the assumption that we're carrying right now is a 2% increase, which probably will end up being a little low. But again, even if it goes up to 2.5% or so, it doesn't have a material impact on the revenue projections. Then we have local receipts. And local receipts, the largest category of local receipts are the local excise taxes, and those are the motor vehicle excise and the meals and rooms excise. And these, along with investment income or interest earnings, are the categories of local receipts that have been hit the hardest through the pandemic. And so we do expect that we will see a significant rebound of these taxes into fiscal 23. Right now, based on our projection or our collections to date in 22, we are assuming that our meals tax and our motor vehicle tax will come back to at about 100% of pre-pandemic. So about 100% of fiscal 19. So we've still lost some growth, but at least we're getting back to where we were before the pandemic. And for rooms tax, right now we're projecting at about 70% of fiscal 19. So in total, we're still down about $1 million, but we're certainly doing much better than we have the last 2 years. And then the last category, the last grouping is available funds or other financing sources. These are all of the individual lines that make up this revenue category, and I've highlighted the ones where we're seeing changes. So the first is transfers from enterprise funds and other credits. This is the amount of money that we charge to enterprise funds for services that the general fund is providing on behalf of the enterprise funds or the other funds. So because we are just at the very beginning of our budget process, we're making an estimate that's just slightly lower than the current year. Now, this probably will go up as we move through our budget process, but this number is pretty steady from year to year. But again, I'm showing something just a little bit lower than what the current year is. The next item where you'll see a change is free cash fiscal year carry forward. And so in both fiscal 21 and 22, we carried a portion of the prior year unspent appropriation forward to help offset some of the impact of the pandemic. In fiscal 22, we carried forward $867,000. This practice of carrying forward is just something that we did during the pandemic. While we have the statutory authority to do this on a year-to-year basis, we didn't do it before the pandemic. Any surplus fell to free cash. And we don't want to do it as we are coming out of the pandemic. We would just have, the assumption is that any surplus from fiscal 22 operations would fall to free cash. So that's why you're seeing a decrease here. If we didn't recapture that, it would have fallen to free cash. And so it is a revenue in that sense. I do see at least one hand up.
Yes, yes, I'm sorry to keep bothering you. How does this compare to the free cash appropriation at town meeting?
We'll talk about free cash on the next slide. So could we hold the free cash questions until the next slide?
Okay.
I do see a couple of additional hands up.
Yeah, Eric, go ahead. You're muted.
Yes, Carrie, I know we talked about this previously, but I'm forgetting, I apologize, I'm forgetting the answer and I don't see it here. How or where do we account for the ARPA funds from the federal government for pandemic relief?
Yeah, so ARPA is a grant and it's not part of the general fund budget. And so it is not included here.
Okay.
So Eric, let me jump in. I think it's a great question. I think it's one of the questions we've got to, I think strategically as a committee, talk about, kind of get better insight as to what we're anticipating those funds being used for, both on the town side and the school side, because those are one-time grants, right? And so the question is, if we start using them for spending that in future years, if once the grant money runs out, if the expectation is general fund money would come in to replace that, we need to understand that, the impact, and then again, kind of figure out affordability and what the trade-offs are doing that. So, not on today's call, but I think that is a topic Chris and I have talked about, where I think the FinCom should get greater detail, a little bit more detail and insight as to what we're planning to do with that money. Dean?
Excuse me. So I have three questions. The first one is about the 5.06 levy capacity and trying to maintain that percentage. If we maintain that percentage, 5.06, I assume, of the total budget, and the budget goes up FY22 over FY23, what do we expect the levy absolute increase in the levy capacity to be in dollars? Do we have some scale for what we're trying to add to our levy capacity?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I followed.
Well, if we're calculating the levy capacity as a percentage of the total budget, and
Yes,
FY '22, it was 5.0, the balance of levy capacity was 5.06% of the budget. And we're trying to maintain that percent. If the budget goes up from 22 to 23, we're going to need to add levy capacity in absolute dollars, just to keep that percentage the same, I assume. Do we have a sense of what the scale is that we're trying to add in terms of, retaining levy capacity? If we're contemplating tax increases approaching 3.5%, it seems difficult to maintain levy capacity when the Prop 2.5 is 2.5. So I'm not sure how we're going to balance that. That's all.
Well, so Dean, can we hold off on that question until we get to Carrie's live model where we can see
Sure.
the trade-offs?
Okay, so I just have two other questions, which are very
Yeah.
simple. The first, the other two are in the transfers line. In 23, are we anticipating continuing to subsidize the BD? So that's number one. And the other one is, it appears as though we've kind of abandoned any idea that we're going to come back and start charging for parking meters again. Is that true? Those are the two things I'm looking at there.
okay, so whether or not BD pays a fee to the general fund, that's an open question that we'll have to resolve that or adjudicate that through the budget process. So the $1.9 million assumes that the same practice in fiscal 22 is being carried in 23. And so that
Okay.
assumption would be that BD is not paying. But that decision has not been made. And then in terms of parking meter receipts, that's the next line I was going down to. So prior to the pandemic, the parking meter activity was funded in a standalone budget, standalone fund. We'll just call it a revolving fund. It's not exactly a revolving fund, but I know you understand that's separate from the general fund.
Okay.
As a result of the pandemic, we were not collecting the same in terms of parking meter receipts, but we had a certain level of expense that we needed to incur to, there were certain contractual obligations and other expenses that needed to be satisfied regardless of the level of activity of meter usage. And so the way that we were able to do that, or what we had to do, was to bring that activity into the general fund budget, because we can't run a deficit in another fund. So we brought it in, but the best practice is to have parking meter standalone. So we brought it in fiscal 22 for 1 year, but we're moving it back to where it should be in 23. And so this $245,000 estimate for receipts in fiscal 22 is what we expect to take in 22, but in a typical year, we're taking in about $400,000. So $155,000 is the subsidy, the general fund subsidy. So we're going to move that back to its rightful place in 23.
So to follow up on that, that means that there's about a $400,000 expense line that you've already accounted for is coming out of expense. Is that must be true then? So in 20, you're saying that that's all going to be doing its thing within this separate revolving like fund. So
Yes.
Does the 23 budget then include a $400,000 reduction in that expense that was covered by 22 because of this extraordinary situation?
It absolutely will. But again, we're at the beginning of our budget process. But the estimates, the 5-year forecast that we prepared pulled that 400,000 back out.
Okay, thanks.
If I, Parashar, if I may, the meters have been back on since April. So we've been charging for meters since April. That is actually the day after Patriots Day.
Thanks.
And then the last item that I wanted to mention in this group is the Emergency Services Stabilization Fund. We appropriated the last amount of that in fiscal 22, $88,150. There is nothing left. That fund has been fully expended or will be at the end of this year. So that's the reduction showing there.
Hey, Mary, go ahead.
I have a question. I'm just trying to understand what we're doing here. At the beginning, I think, Parashar, you told us that we could do a bottoms-up approach to look at some other economic indicators. And because of that, you were recommending, or you're proposing a 3.27% increase to the property tax based on a 3.1% overall guideline increase. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, and I wouldn't quite say I was proposing, but yeah, you could.
Well, you
know,
were just
approach
showing
and-
us a way to look at it, right?
Yeah, one way to look at it. Now what
Okay.
we're trying to do is, right,
And so what-
is for Carrie to say, well, where do we stand with revenue? Just because remember, a number of committee members are new to the
Yep.
committee, right? To
Yep.
give them a sense of what does the current estimate of revenue look like? And today, if we use those revenue estimates,
Right.
plug it into her guideline model, can see what that looks like, and then really have a discussion of what we want the preliminary guideline to look like right now. That's all.
I understand. And so I think that's what you did with the 3.1% proposed guideline increase. And you came up with a 3.27% property tax increase, right? And that 3.27% property tax increase assumed the revenue assumptions that Carrie's talking us through now and the fixed costs assumptions that Carrie's going to talk us through in a few minutes, right? Where I'm lost is right here, it says the property tax is going to increase by 2.73%. And I guess that was to hold the levy limit constant, but that wasn't, see, there's a disconnect here that I'm having a hard time understanding.
Carrie, do you want to take that?
Mary, we just started out at the 505 as the placeholder. As
Yep.
we go in and look at what we actually need, we're going to have to go under 505 to hit his 3.1. We can't
Okay, so-
hold at
But we
505.
shouldn't even be looking at that 2.73% number, really.
It's just the starting point for the way the model works.
If we hold the levy limit.
If you
okay.
hold the levy
Okay,
limit flat,
okay.
which we're not going to be able to do.
Okay,
I
so
doubt. So
what this slide is really telling us, I think, to me, what I'm getting from this is, here's what we think the revenue inputs are going to be when we try to figure out what our guidelines should be.
Yes.
that's right.
Okay,
And
thank you.
the critical thing is it's flat. We did not get a bump from revenue because even though meals and local
point.
are up, these
Yep.
other buckets are down. So we're actually net down on revenue. So
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
All right, so then. So then let's just take a look at free cash. And we talked about this back October 14th when the town presented its response to your requests. And what we said back then is our estimate over here, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but on the top right-hand side, that while we have not yet had free cash certified as of June 30, 2021, we are estimating it to be $8.5 million. And we talked the last time, and if you go back over here on the left-hand side, we talked about the reasons for the increase. That even after we set aside that $867,000 carry forward, we still had favorable results of fiscal 21 operations to the tune of about $500,000. We had some closeout of prior year encumbrances. And so when we encumber money, sometimes it still is an estimate. And as the project or purchase is finalized, sometimes there's extra money and that closes out. So we do have some of that. We had a significant reduction in property tax receivables, even though our property tax collections are incredibly high. We still had about a 50% reduction fiscal 21 over fiscal 20. And then we did receive that grant from the state for the Cambridge Turnpike that was in process. That was a timing issue at the close of fiscal 20. So about $8.5 million. That represents 7.13% of the fiscal 22 budget. The policy requirements are a minimum of 5%, which is just under $6 million, to a maximum of 10%, which is $11,900,000. And so we're well within the requirements. We're 3.4 million below the maximum. And if you assume, as we have in the revenue projections, that we're going to use $1 million of free cash to reduce the property tax levy, that brings us down to a balance of $7.5 million, or 6.29%. And so this is important because you know that there will be, or there are likely to be, additional requests for free cash appropriations in separate warrant articles. And so just with this assumption, we bring that down to 6.29%. Now, Peggy, I want to make sure I answered your question before we move on.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so here is a summary of the fixed costs. And we did go through a lot of these on October 14th, so I don't need to spend a lot of time here. The fixed costs are our insurances, our OPEB assessment, or our OPEB contribution, retirement assessment, debt service, and other insurances. We really, in terms of budgeting, we're really doing very well with our fixed costs. I mean, you often, if you look at budgets, you often see that these categories of spending can have pretty significant increases year over year. But in total, these fixed costs are projected to increase just under 2%, 1.95%, $528,000 on about $27 million worth of spending. So this is really relatively minor increases. And the reasons really that we're doing so well is the increase in the retirement assessment is only projected at 2%. We are approaching fully funded status, and we've had very strong earnings on assets. And so we're able to keep that at 2%. And the OPEB contribution is flat. And this is based on the new methodology that we adopted in conjunction with our actuary to smooth the budgetary impact of the OPEB contribution as we move toward fully funded status. And so I'm happy to answer specific questions or questions about these specific assumptions, but we did talk about them, I think, at a fairly detailed level on October 14th.
Carrie, just before you get into questions, I just want to point out to the committee. So the reason why this is important is the math that we do to figure out what we have available for guidelines starts with non-property tax revenue, property tax estimate. We subtract these fixed costs, which are assumed to be non-discretionary, if you will. They need to be taken out. And then you come to what's available for guidelines. And that's the dollar amount that we can allocate to the business units. So that's why we're taking you through these categories. Sorry, Carrie, go ahead.
Oh, that's fine. There are a couple of other hands up.
Peggy, and then Dean and Brian. Peggy?
Oh, I just I would just like to congratulate our town finance operation that is including Carrie and Tony, because we started paying this off very early. And I think one of the reasons we're in such good shape is the recent run up in the market. But it's an incredible advantage. So Carrie, I just want to thank you so much. That's it for me.
Thanks, Peggy. Dean?
So one thing that we had approved, I think it was last year at town meeting, was the increase in the retirement COLA. Was that applied in 22, or will that hit in 23? My recollection it was not hitting in 22. And is that included here, the increase that was approved for the retirement COLA?
So the retirement assessment that we're showing is based on the January 1st, 2021 valuation, and it does include the COLA adjustment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dean. Brian, you had your hand up. Did you get your question answered?
Yeah, I think so. I was just looking at the property liability line. I was reading the text. It wasn't quite clear, but the assumption here is that the risk committee will positively impact to the downside is really what we're talking about in terms of maintaining premiums down. That I just wanted clarification. Thanks,
Yes.
Carrie.
Okay, thanks, Carrie.
So Chris actually covered this slide nicely for us already. So this is just a summary again of the amount that is available for guidelines. So revenue, we have a dollar increase of $2,659,000, assuming those assumptions. The expenditures here are the fixed costs. So once we back out the fixed costs increase, which is $528,000, there is an amount available for guidelines of $2,131,460, which is a 2.31% increase.
If we don't change the levy capacity.
Right.
So, right? So you wouldn't have enough if we didn't change the levy capacity, if you didn't come down below 5%.
And
And
remarkably,
the property tax increase would be 2.73%. Do I have that right? The levy capacity is flat, doesn't change. Well, the percent doesn't change. We have 2.7 available for guidelines, and the property tax increase would be, I thought we started with 2.73% at the very first slide. We got a lot of numbers floating around here.
I do have a slide that shows the property tax increase. Do you want to move to that?
it's amazing that the amount that's available is almost on the numbers for the sustainable growth rate. Sustainable growth rate was 2.3. This is 2.21. It's amazing, but
That's a coincidence, Dean.
it's a coincidence. I know.
That's a total coincidence.
I know it's just a coincidence.
Sorry, but that's a coincidence.
But it's just in the numbers. They just fall out.
Yeah. Yeah, Mary, if you stayed at this number, the tax increase to the base is 2.46%.
2.46, okay.
Yeah, that's what it says on Carrie, on your last schedule. I think that shows the guidelines model, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so
So Carrie, can we, do you want to just quickly touch what the alternative revenue assumption here is, or do we go to the next slide?
Sure. Let me just mention these three items that you may want to consider in some way, shape, or form. And so the first that I noted is the new growth assumption. I had mentioned that we're carrying 800,000. The last 2 years have been about 950. Prior to that, it was higher. So you could say you would like to make an assumption that new growth is going to be somewhat higher. And I put 150 in there because that would bring it up to 950. That would add, obviously, $150,000, 0.16% increase on the to the guidelines budgets. You could also reduce the unused levy capacity. You certainly could pick any assumption, but this assumption is that you would, instead of keeping the percent flat, you would keep the dollar amount flat. And this maybe was the question Dean was asking earlier, that to increase, to keep it flat at the percentage, it's $166,134.
That is exactly the question I was asking. So there's the number. Thank you.
Or you could say, maintain the property tax increase at 2.5% to the existing base. That would add $44,000. So these are a few of the assumptions, and these are the only alternative revenue assumptions that I would offer up at this point, or these types, really just to property tax, because we don't have any insight into the state budget. We have limited insight into local receipts for the current year, and we're at the beginning of the budget process, so we don't have anything additional to offer in terms of other financing sources. And then I am not at this time offering up any alternative expenditure assumptions. So if you were to say, sure, we agree with all of these things, that would bring the available amount, a budgetary increase for guidelines, up to 2.7%, or just under $2.5 million.
All right, let's go to the next slide, Carrie. So this
Yeah,
is
and
the
so
one-
then here we are at the guidelines model, and this is a picture of it. So when you're ready, I'll move into the live version.
Yeah, so let's drop the screen share and maybe just get a gauge from folks. The thought would be to maybe see if we can come up with a consensus approach. Do we want to stick with the 2.7? There are a lot of numbers thrown up there. The number that Terry said we can increase it by without increasing the property taxes beyond what would be expected to keep the levy amount the same, or do we want to take another approach? Let me just get people's thoughts, and I see John's joined us as well. Maybe go around the horn, and then as a consensus emerges, we can ask Carrie to open up her model, and we can plug that in. Does that sound about right to the committee?
Yep.
Okay, so Mary, so you said yes first. You get to have your say first.
I think it's a very strong probability that we will approve the middle school, and that's going to, as we know, put quite a burden on our property taxes. So I think anything that we can do to keep the property taxes from operating expenses under 3% is where we should stay. So I would be willing to start out at 2.5 and then see if Carrie can have some, if the revenue projections are better than we thought, or if the fixed costs are lower than we thought, which has happened in the past, we might be able to relax that. But starting out, I would feel comfortable with the 2.5% increase, which is the 2.7% guideline.
Okay, good. Chris?
Okay, I'm good. Yeah, Mary, I agree with your comments. I guess one question that I have is the 505. So looking at the levy limit question, I'm not concerned at coming under on the levy limit a little bit, so that doesn't bother me. I don't know. And Carrie, I think when you did the work for the capital planning forum, that was the meeting between school committee and select board, you sent out a schedule afterwards. For FY23, if we were to put some, I think there were bands or some sort of anticipation notes that you put in, and I think we pay interest on those only. Do you have an estimate for what that is to the tax bill for FY23?
I certainly could open up the spreadsheet. I can't tell you without going back in and looking at the spreadsheet. But
Yeah, I'd like you to look at that because that's a piece of data I would like to have as I consider it. So if there was no impact in total, I'd like to keep it just under or right around 3, not over 3. But I want to understand the impact if we float bans in FY23. What does that do to the tax bill? Is it big or
So
small?
Chris, so while Carrie looks that up, let me keep going around the
Yep,
horn here,
go ahead.
right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still trying to process this. It all sounds good to keep it low. I agree with what Mary said, and I think I understand her logic. And so, yeah, I would say keeping it low now, 2.5 feels good, even 2.7.
Okay. D.
If I understand correctly, we have about $150,000 in potential new growth. And I'd like to know, are we talking about a 0.16% increase to the 2.7%? Is that what, if you added that 150K in there? Is that correct, Carrie?
okay, I can only do one thing at a time.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
D, I think, so we had an assumption of 800,000 in the base model here for
That is correct.
FY23,
Yes.
right? And now she's,
And
this could bump you up to 950.
That
Yeah.
is correct.
Yeah,
That's
so
what
it's
I.
a-
and then
150,000
the
more in
correspond-
revenue.
Excuse me, the
Sorry.
corresponding percent increase is a 0.16%.
It could be, I don't know
On
where our
that
schedule said.
slide.
Okay,
Yes.
So
but
it
that would mean,
you would add that to the 2.7%?
No,
no,
that was in the 2.7.
that's in
Oh,
the
that
2.7.
was
No,
included.
it's not.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
At the
Not
bottom,
go back to
Not
that.
an additional not the additional 150K. The 800 is in the 2.7.
Well, let's do this. D, let's hold
Yeah,
that
you have to
question
put the
while
schedule
Carrie
back
answers
up,
the
I
first
think.
question, and then we'll come back to that question. Brian.
Okay, great.
Brian.
I actually appreciated Mary's comments, and I agree with that. I think we would want to err on the side of being a little bit conservative here, especially coming out of COVID, and the major consideration of the school. So I would side with Mary on this.
Okay, Eric.
I agree. I think I'm in sync with the emerging consensus we have here.
Okay, so far the emergent consensus is under 3%, but start at 2.5, I think, is the quote I wrote down for Mary. Okay.
Yep.
Dean.
I've got a couple points. I don't think it should be a goal of this committee to try to add absolute dollars to the levy capacity. I mean, our goal should be to try to, meet the needs of the town and not dig into whatever available levy capacity is there. If we add levy capacity as a byproduct of our consideration of what's needed for the town, that's all to the good, but it should not be a goal to try to add capacity. So I think that this idea of level percentage, which forces us to always try to add a few bucks to the levy capacity, is probably a fool's errand, or something that we should really not be striving towards. Where our goal should be to not cut into that if we can. I think that I have a question about, the methodology that you were presenting, Parashar, where we were applying an employment cost index of 3.4% and then, arriving at some numbers. I'm just wondering how realistic that is in light of the fact that we just signed agreements with the CCTA and the CTA. And I don't know if we could even hold to that number. I would really appreciate some insight from either Dr. Hunter or from Jared regarding how realistic even holding at 3.4 would be. In terms of the overall number, I would love to see that number finally be not start with a 3. That would be, to me, that would be a kind of an objective, is to just not have us dipping over 3. It just seems like we're going through a bright line in my view. I do have one other point here, and it's off budget, but I expect that the free cash slide that Carrie showed will probably require us to really think hard about stabilization, more stabilization money for the middle school project in the future. So we will probably be down below that 6.9% number that was on her slide if we put 1 or 2 million aside for future use as a stabilization number. It will no longer be, although it's available money that the town will have for its future needs, it will not be counted towards free cash, and we will be getting our, be cutting in. So that's it's an off budget item. It's not a guidelines thing. I just thought I'd point that out. Thanks.
Yep. And before Lori answers the question around the 3.4 and the contracts, Dean, let me clarify. When I did that methodology, it wasn't to expect the schools or the towns to hold their salaries to 3.4.
Oh, no, I know it was a rubric to use, but if we're using a rubric and it turns out to be not realistic, we should probably get a dose of realism. That's the only reason.
Well, so I agree, and I guess here's where I'm coming from, right? So at the end of the day, the contracts are the contracts.
Right.
We're expected, we're expecting the towns and the schools to hold to a certain budget amount. If it's anything less than the contract increase on the benefit side and the salary side, they're going to have to find room elsewhere in their budget, period, regardless of.
This is a conversation that we've had ever since I've been on the committee, and that is that we are, as a committee, always working behind the curve. We're asking for this kind of increase, and the budget for the schools it has these contractual obligations that get baked in the cake. And so it squeezes everything else if the contract that they have, stretches them, and they have to find, conservation efforts all in the remainder. So I was just asking a question about how realistic that number is relative to the way the contracts will behave with the staffing that we have now. That's all.
Do you want me to hop in, Parasha?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what Dean's really asking, Dean, is, we showed a salary increase line for CPS and CCHS. I can go back to it for reference, but I think, Dean, you're asking, well, what is the expected year-over-year growth under the contracts for the next 2 to 3 years?
Right. We had broken out those budgets in your slides using employment as, employees as one of the lines, and then applying your employment cost index of 3.4.
Well, let me clarify this a little bit, because I think you're asking an important question. So yes, I use 3.4 just for fiscal year 23 to get to a guideline number, but I think the answer to your question is over here. So, and Lori can jump in, but you can see these are the cost projections using the contractual, the contracts that we just agreed to. Is that right, Lori?
Correct, at least through the life of the current contracts.
And when do those contracts end, Lori?
So
24.
So if we look at
So Dean, I think the relevant question, it's a good one. After 24, the rate increase goes from 4.5 down to 3.93837. And I think the question is, can we negotiate new contracts at that rate or lower, or are we going to still be in the mid 4s?
No, that's not really my question, because we're working with this year's guideline. So, okay, this year's guideline, you used a rubric with 3.4, but that's for all employment. And you can see here, we have contractual teacher employment, and we have non-teacher salary.
Yes.
And those are very different. So if we net those out, are we close to 3.4 in the year, just in the 23 year that we're talking about tonight, which is a guideline conversation? Are we close to 3.4? What will the number look like?
Parashar, one way to look at that is on your, my favorite chart of yours. So if you look at for CPS and for CCHS, what they asked I shouldn't say asked, that's the wrong word, what they had in their FY23 projection, Dean. So the
Yeah.
overall increase for CPS was 3.6%. Parashar's bottoms up is 3.2. Most of that is related to, most of the cost growth is tied up in salary and benefits. So the CPS projection was 3.6 versus 3.2. For the high school, their projection was 3.0 in total costs for FY23 growth. And our Parashar's math came up with 3.1. So the high school is very close. CPS is a bit behind what the school projected.
Okay, I guess I
Does that help?
Yeah, a little. If I look at the numbers here, I'm sort of netting 4.2 and 3.2, although 4.2, it should be weighted at about 2 to 1.
Right.
If we're looking at CCTA salaries and non-teacher salaries, you're going to come up with a blend there between those two line items. For the summary line, we were calling employment in Parashar's guideline summary calculation, which he applied 3.4 right there. So personnel, he applied 3.4, and it might turn out, if you blend those two lines of salary teacher salary and non-teacher salary, if you blend those, you might come close, but it doesn't look like it's CCHS. You're going to be even in the ballpark. You're going to probably be somewhere around 4. And it'd be just because of the weighting of there's twice as many dollars being spent on teacher salaries. So anyway.
But there's a lot more teachers at CPS, right? So there's a different math at CPS, right?
Yeah, it's
So
a little,
that's
the
where-
math is different in different, it's
Yeah.
different in different systems. But I'm just saying that the way we applied the rubric that Parashar used with an employment cost index, based on where we are in terms of the fact that we've signed some contracts, it's going to put a lot more pressure on the schools to find ways to be
Yeah.
conservative.
I mean, it's not that different from the SGR, right? So it's an
No.
inflation-based measure, right?
Yeah,
So
no, I know.
it's one,
I know.
this is the prelim, right? So they haven't come back with
Right.
what they need. And just one other factor, and I meant to say it in my earlier comments. So at the schools, we're at max E&D. We have a $200,000 stabilization reserve. I'm not sure that's the right word, but that's what they put up. They also have fully funded athletics and lunch projects, right? So there was money that they were unable to spend due to COVID in FY21. And I assume they have maybe some of that in FY22. They certainly had it in FY20. So that's going to factor into, and also they have about, I think, $1.5 to $2 million in ESSER money that they can spend in FY23 and I think FY24. So there's a lot of grant money that's around too to deal with certain of the things, not salaries per se, but certainly, what Parashar mentioned is if the balloon is pushing on one side, is there room somewhere else? And I think they'd have that room.
Right. I don't want to belabor this. I don't want to belabor. It was one piece of the way that the guideline estimate Parashar put out was done. And it seemed like it might be out of alignment with the reality that we face. That's all. That's all.
Well, and Dean, I agree with you that it does seem that way, right? But I guess, normally we go around and we're doing what we're doing. What do we think? 2%, 3%? Relatively kind of arbitrary, but also trying to balance the impact on taxpayers and the levy limit, et cetera. I was just thinking maybe as a starting point, you actually look at what some objective measures of cost increases might be and use that as a guide.
Yep.
All of this, I think, is an art, not a science, right?
Yep. I agree.
So
Entirely.
Lois, we're going to keep going around. D, I haven't forgotten about you. And I know, Chris, you had a question that Carrie was looking up. Lois.
I don't have a lot to add to what's been said. And to bring it back to the place where we were kind of arriving at consensus, what Mary said at the beginning resonated with me. We are the middle school project is the 100 million pound gorilla lurking off stage. The good news, and I do think that we should be factoring the reality that the school really does need a new middle school, that the town really does need a new middle school. So we should be assuming that something is going to be happening there. I also think that there's good news here. This is a preliminary process, and there's, from what everything Carrie was saying, there's some upside. I think she is appropriately starting with some pretty conservative assumptions. If we start in that 2.5 range, if we avoid that 3 at the beginning now to get things kicked off and get started and frame the process, we may have some room to move based on how those numbers firm up, that Carrie appropriately was pointing out she just can't have yet. But there are reasons to be somewhat optimistic about some of the revenue figures. So for our present purposes, I'm with Mary and a lot of the other members of the committee who said, we should stay around 2.5 now, get the process started and see what develops.
Okay, thank you. Peggy? Kathy?
Yes, thank you. It does seem that we're developing a consensus here. I too would like to see us be in the 2.5 ballpark. And definitely not 3. So, Mary, good leadership there. Thank you.
Thanks.
Greg?
I don't have any comment at this time. Trying to get my feet to see what you guys are talking about. So
Kids are off safely to bed?
I don't know about that. Dawn and I high-fived as we walked past each other in the kitchen. So
John?
Mary Hartman, such a thought leader. Maybe I can go first next time and see if I can get anyone to agree with me.
It helps to go first.
The thing that really resonated about what Mary said, as someone pointed out, the numbers are somewhat arbitrary, but the thing that resonated with me about what Mary said was, 2 years from now, we're going to be making a really big ask of the town and the taxpayer. And I think we should start thinking about that now. And I hope the budgets and the town budgets and the school budgets hopefully will take that into serious consideration now in preparation for that. So
to clarify, that really big ask is anticipated for a January special town meeting.
Yeah.
Not 2 years from now.
Yeah. Well, the tax impact, will be somewhat further down the road, but nonetheless considerable. And I think we should start preparing the ground, for that now. So those are my comments.
Okay, thank you, John. Let me go to Carrie. Do you have the spreadsheet you needed to answer Chris's question?
I do. So that spreadsheet assumes a $50 million note, which I think is pretty high. But the impact of a $50 million note is about $175. So I would say it's probably more likely in fiscal 23 that maybe there would be about $100 worth of add to the tax bill, and that may even be a little high as well. And then D had.
Hold on, Carrie. Chris, I don't think you gave us oh no, you did actually. I'm sorry. You said not over 3%. Okay, sorry, Carrie. Go ahead.
No, I think it's probably easiest if I could just pull up that page to make sure we get the question answered. So I think it was on this page, D.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's under alternative revenue assumptions.
Yeah.
And number 1 is the level fund new growth.
Right.
Hey, can you state the question again, just so I'm aware? Thanks.
Right now, if I understand correctly, right now, Carrie has used $800,000 in revenue on new growth associated with new growth. However, there's the opportunity that that is a lesser amount than what would actually come in. And so this other number she has here of $150,000 would add 0.16% to the,
2.31%.
is it the 2.31? Okay,
So, right, 2.31 is what is available to guidelines with the first set of assumptions.
okay.
And these additional assumptions would have the.
So that would bring it up to 2.47.
Correct.
Okay, so that was my question. That was, I wanted to know the implication of adding that an additional $150,000 to what we have available. As we look at the next slide, which is going to be, or the, you know, the graph that's going to calculate the distributions. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is that's what it would do? Okay. So that was, and that's a suggestion I'd like us to consider. It is still under the 2.5%, but it gives us a little bit more money. And if people don't want to do it, that's fine. I just am throwing it out there as a suggestion.
So Dee, I appreciate the suggestion. Question for you.
Mhm.
Almost with or without the suggestion, because I think the two are independent perhaps. Or are you saying that what percent increase in the guidelines would you be in favor of? And does it depend at all on whether you make a slight change in the revenue assumption?
I'm in favor of the 2.5%.
Okay. Independent of whether we make the change in the revenue assumption, right?
That is correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I want to understand. Okay. Thank you. Okay, I think everybody's had their choice. I'll come back to the revenue assumption piece in a minute. So I'm coming at it from a slightly different perspective. I did the bottom up just to get a sense of, hey, if you kind of look at what the major drivers are and you assume certain level of inflation, what would the number have to be quote unquote, and this is what I'm about to say is not objective, it's subjective, but to be relatively reasonable, if you will, knowing that this is a preliminary number, and if the revenues come down or go worse for the final one, we could always bring them down. So I was thinking start at the numbers that I shared with you, 3.1, and then scale back in December. But as I said earlier, all of this is an art and not a science. And so the consensus, I think, is 2.5, start there and then see if we can move up in December. So
I just want to be clear, Parashar, that 2.5 would be the impact to the property tax, which I think if we have Carrie's latest revenue projections would give a 2.7% guideline increase. Is that
okay,
correct?
so thank you for clarifying. So that's a little better. That makes me feel a little bit better.
Or at least that's how I understood it. That's,
I think Chris is nodding yes, and Carrie's
that
not
right?
saying anything,
Okay,
so I'm assuming
good.
that's yes.
okay. Good.
Yeah. So that would assume, Mary, just to make sure, so you would go with the adjustments to revenue to get to 2.7% on the guideline.
Exactly.
I agree with that. And that, you know, that
So-
makes sense to me. Just one other point people to recognize, right? So we're, that $100, so Mary, you talked about the tax bill. So I just want people to think about that, right? So there was one of the charts in Mary's, in Carrie's presentation showed what the actual rate of increase has been. It was sort of a little, a line chart.
Yep.
And I think, Carrie, if I'm right, we really haven't been near 3 for a while, right? We've been about 2.5, a little bit under 2.5 for the past couple of years. So I don't have that chart in front of me here. I'm going to see if I can find it. So even though sometimes we set it higher, new growth comes in. So when we actually do the final, I have it here. It's like we were at 2.68 last year, 2.80, and then 2.56. And the year before that in FY18, we were at 3.2. So we've been hovering around there. So if in FY23, the bump to the tax bill related to the middle school debt is $100, that's not a lot, right? The full bump is over 1,000. So the hit is on the debt is really going to come later. So I want to make sure. So Mary, I hear you, but it's not going to hit in FY23.
I
So
understand.
one question is, if we start to, one of my thinking was, which is why I was closer to 3, was because I want to start level loading a little bit here, because it's not going to stick around 2.5 for a while. It is starting to go up once the tax bill hits. So anyway, that's just another way of thinking about it. That's why I was willing to go a little higher.
So, so let's do this, because I'd like to draw this meeting to a close so we can vote on it. What I would propose is, Carrie, if you can pull up your guideline model, just so that everybody's clear. And I need a motion on the table, but it sounds a motion is to use the alternative revenue assumptions that Carrie displayed and to set a preliminary guideline increase of 2.73%. Is that what I heard, Mary?
Yes.
Okay. And then the next question would be, how do we distribute it among the 3 groups? I know last year, I think we did it based on their total budgets, if memory serves me.
Last year we did that, Parashar, after we took off, after we gave to the high school the amount of the increase because of the enrollment shift.
That's right.
But this year, it's not material, so we don't have to do that. But you're right. It was basically a weighted average.
Folks feel comfortable going with the weighted average approach for this year then?
I have a different comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure how this will factor in terms of the distribution, but I would like to see the town have an increase of the $1 million towards its tier 1 expenses, rather than the 7.1 and then the increment. I'd like to see it raised back to what it was preliminary, in the years past. So it would be over at like an 8.1.
So that would take up $1 million of the 2.7.
That is correct.
Okay. So let's, do you want to make a formal motion for that, or do we want to get a consensus as to whether folks feel comfortable about that?
Do we do it in this session? Do we do it in the guidelines session? Is it now? Is it later?
No, it's now.
Yeah, it's now.
It's now.
It's
I
now.
like it, and my reasoning for that is I think that the schools are in, the high school certainly is in a very good position. And I think that we can maybe shift and provide more funds to the town at this point in time. And it seems to me that the area that they could use it the most is in the services, in the tier 1 expenses.
So can I ask Parashar, if we go with the 2.73%, what's the dollar value of that? Is that 2.9?
So
What
the
is that?
dollar value of 2.71%?
It's on the chart.
2.73% total guideline.
It's 2.5 million and change.
2.5 million. Okay, so that would be, if we took the million out and gave it to the town, we would have $1.5 million left over for the schools.
Yeah.
Well, either that or however you want to distribute that.
You'd have less, because I think what I heard Dee say is of the 2.5, take $1 million, give it back to the town for tier 1. That would still leave the town needing money for the rest of the spending.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
That is correct. Yeah. I mean, in part of the distribution across the 3, yes. You'd have 1.5 million across the distribution of the 3, of the 2 schools and the town on the employee side, or the non-expense side.
Okay, so you're going to make that motion, Dee, and then we'll see if we get a second.
Yes,
So
I'll make
before-
that motion.
Can I share my
That-
screen, Carrie? Because I'm doing this a little bit on the fly for folks. So just to give
So
people
the
a sense of
motion-
what's going on.
Okay, the motion is to award the town $1 million for expenses, to increase their expense amount, their tier 1 expenses, and then to distribute, as the committee feels free to do, the additional 1.5 million across 2 or 3 categories, being the town, the CPS, and the CCHS.
And so if folks can see my screen, what you're left with here is, this would be the rough allocation of the 2.5.
Mm-hmm.
So the town would be getting 2 million.
They'd be getting 1.4 million, because it would be the 488 plus the million here, right? And then the
Oh,
school
okay,
would
so
get
it's the 1,000,005.
CPS
I
would
see.
get-
Yeah.
CPS would get 688, and the CCHS would get 352.
Okay.
And you can see, these are a little bit higher, but you can kind of see where this comes out.
Parshar, can I just ask a question? I'm sorry, you've lost me here a little bit in the math. My understanding was our baseline sort of consensus agreement was that we were receptive to the 2.7 based on Carrie's schedule, which is 2.491 million, not 2.53. So I'm just trying to understand where is this number coming from, please?
It's roughly, my 92.7 may or may not tie into Carrie, but that's kind of where that comes from, basically. I don't know, Carrie, let me stop this share there. Carrie, where are you carrying the number? It's roughly close.
Yeah, so we're about $30,000 off.
Yeah, and the 30,000, Carrie, is because I had forgotten to include one of the town spending items, the P&L. I had forgotten to include that as expenses. That's where the difference is.
So could I humbly request that we use Carrie's schedule, just so
Sure.
my brain explode?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I just want to make sure, I have two highlighted here, 2 lines. I'm not sure I understood. One, the first one is using the existing revenue assumptions, but adding in the 3 additional ones. And then
Can you make the print a little larger, please? I'm sorry. I'm getting old here.
I'm turning off my screen so I can put my eyeglasses up and stick my nose right to the screen.
Yeah, me too. Go ahead, Carrie, go ahead. So the 2.
There you go. Thank you.
Go ahead, Carrie.
is this,
Yeah.
Yes.
So the 2.7, which is the purple line, assumed the 3 increased revenue assumptions.
it does, but starting from a property tax increase of 2.46, which leaves leaving the levy capacity at 5.05. But then I know you were talking about starting from a 2.5%.
Right.
Then adding. And so I don't know which one you want to work with, but those are, they're not significantly different, but they are different.
I think the motion is 2.71, as you showed before. And what Dee suggested is, out of the 2.71, take $1 million and give it to the town, and then distribute the remaining to the 3 budget units based on the proportion of their spending.
Parashar, I think Carrie's asking, do we want the 2.7 or the 2.75? Because we're before the $1 million to the town.
I would think 2.7 would be the appropriate one, because it's closer to 2.71, right?
Well, but when I did the 2.7, I was going off the 2.5% property tax increase. I always go back to the
Oh.
property tax increase. So what Kerry's showing us now is if
Yeah.
we assume a 2.5% property tax increase,
Yeah.
we can have a 2.75% guideline increase.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, I hear the mood of the committee, the consensus committee to start conservative, so maybe we start at 2.70, the first rub.
Okay, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think there's a feeling that we ought to be conservative, so let's start there,
Okay,
right?
okay, sorry, go ahead.
Did we get a second for D's initial motion?
No,
Nope.
because I was asking to see I wanted to see what the distribution would be like for the CPS and CCHS if we were to take $1 million off the top and give it to the town. I
So-
don't know how much room,
Can
wiggle
we
room
do,
it leaves them.
could we do that now? So Kerry, we're saying that we want the 2,491,608 to distribute among the three budgeting entities. And if we took the million out of right off the top, how much?
And
would
that is for expenses, town expenses.
Yeah,
Well,
I don't
it's
know that
Tier
we
one-
can
tier
specify
one
what it's
expenses.
for.
No,
You
I
guys.
don't think you can tell them what it's for, D. You're just gonna give them more money in the
You're gonna
spending
give them money.
guideline.
You
You're
can't.
just giving them
you really
money.
Can't
don't have-
specify what line item it goes to.
Why not? Why
because
can't
we
we?
don't have that authority.
It doesn't work that way, right?
Doesn't
We're
work
just
that
giving
way.
them overall guidelines on the budget. We don't hit them at the line item. That's not our role.
Right.
You can use it as your rationale.
Hold on, one at a time. So Kathy, you have a question?
I don't understand I'm sorry, you guys lost me. I don't understand what we're doing.
Okay, let's back up here for a minute. And Lois, I think you had your hand up as well. So what we have is a motion, hasn't been seconded. Dee's making is to basically take the 2.491 that you see in cell N is an NC 28. Because the consensus of the committee, Kathy, is to give a guideline number that's 2.71. And what you have there, 2.70 is the closest. So if we were to give that number, we'd have 2.49 million to distribute between the three groups. Dee's proposal is to take $1 million of that 2.491 and give it to the town right off the bat, because they brought their tier one spending down last year by $1 million. And then Dee's saying of the 1.5 million that's left over, distribute it to the other three entities, based on weighted average of their spending relative to total spending.
No, I
So
didn't add that part to it.
Oh.
I understand it. And if you want to do that, that's fine, but I did not add that.
Okay, I'm sorry. So we're trying to figure out what the impact, trying to figure out how much money would be left over to give to everybody. if we
So
did that.
can I paraphrase Parashah to see if I understand?
Yeah,
So we're setting a guideline, but we're setting a guideline, and rather than just letting the town take that increase and allocate it as they see fit, we're saying out of that guideline, 1 million has to go to the general expenses of the town and not to the schools.
no.
well, no. So what we have to do, Kathy, and Lois, I see your hands up. Let me just clarify for Kathy. The 2.491 in guideline spending has to be allocated across all three units. So it's not just going all to the town. See where it says, where the blue arrow's pointing down? And it says 92 million there. We have to allocate the 2.49 so that where it says 0 in cell, what is it,
Yep.
I-21 totals 2.49. So we're trying to figure out the allocation. Lois, you had a question?
Yeah, you addressed part of what I wanted to say, which was just by clarifying it. It is our job in setting the guidelines, as I understand it, to also indicate how it should be allocated among the three different budgeting entities. And my extensive experience of this, having done it once before last year, was that we allocated it evenly, and I gather that is something we've done in the past. I'm actually very sympathetic to Dee's motion. I'm very open to Dee's motion because I do feel the town took particular hits in getting through the pandemic. And I also feel that from the presentations the town has made, there's a lot of deferred spending. There's a lot of postponed problems that really do need to be addressed. And I think there's a very strong argument to be made that we shouldn't just evenly allocate it this year, that we should accommodate that and allocate it differently so the town gets a higher percentage. I don't know if $1 million is the number. It feels like it just came up and suddenly we're all focused on that one number. I know we need to make a decision on this tonight, so I want to hear more. But I'm a little confused between the principle of giving the town more of an allocation, which I'm completely sympathetic to, and the amount that we allocate. I just would like to hear maybe some more from Carrie, from other members of the committee, about what the right number is to address what I think has been a historical imbalance in how the guideline spending has been allocated amongst the three major budgetary divisions.
Yeah, fair enough. So Stephen, you had your hand raised and then you put it down. Did you want to say something?
Well, I just don't know when the right time is to say something.
Go right ahead, and then I'll go to Dean.
Well, I guess what I would say is, do you want, is the motion going to be seconded to even have the discussion?
Well, I guess that's a good question. What I was hoping to do was actually see what how much money's left over for everything. But the part, I guess, I still don't have a second. If somebody wants to make a second, happy to entertain it. And
Lois
Dean,
seems
did
like
you
a
have
natural.
question also? Dean?
I'm going to second it because I'd like to continue the discussion.
So
Dean?
Sorry. No, I was just gonna, I was sorry, go ahead, Dean, I can wait.
Okay, so to Lois's point regarding handing, an extra lump of money to an entity when in this process. Last year we did that, and we've already described it, which is that we sort of set aside a certain amount of money because we recognized that at the CCHS budgeting allocation level, Concord was kind of going to be in a downward mode because we had more students attending, and so we put more money in there. Now the administration can do what they want with the money. We can't tell them what to do with the money, but we could increase their allocation, recognizing that they had a budget hole that would be difficult to overcome without that money. And so we did that, and we took the rest of the funds and we spread them through the three entities on a proportional basis. And I think that's what we're proposing to do here, which is to, tear out a certain amount of funding to allocate to the town, recognizing that at least in this line item, they've taken a huge hit. Do we give them the full $1 million? Do we give them a sub amount? Doesn't, that's for this discussion, but the principle is identical to what we did last year for CCHS's budget, because we recognized a specific budget problem that needed to be filled, and that needed extra money before we went through a proportional allocation. And I think that's what this year's conversation is exactly about.
Okay, so thank you for the clarification. And Chris or Mary or Dean, you guys know the process rules here more than I do, but I think we have a motion on the table. It's been seconded, and we're still debating the motion, I think. Is that correct, Mary?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
The number that we looked at for the tier 1 spending of the 7.1, that was the budgeted number, right?
That is correct.
Okay.
That was the 2022 budget number, yes.
Okay, it was the budgeted number, right?
Right.
But I just want to remind us that at the end of the year, remember, we did use some free cash to, or we used some surplus. not free cash, wrong word. We used some surplus to in fact fund some tier one spending.
It
So
went for those were the vehicles.
that's
And
right.
it also went for the Monument Street.
The
If you
culvert,
drive out there, the problem they have with I don't know.
the culvert.
creek.
The road,
Yeah, the
exactly.
road,
Exactly.
yeah.
So it's kind of looking at the budget number and how it's not really accurate to look at the budget number. It might be much more accurate to look at what we actually spent, even though it didn't come out of the line item on the budget. So, that's all I'll say.
Stephen?
While I'm always in favor of taking it from the schools and giving it to the town, I'm kind of
Why
kidding.
I'm still on the call, Stephen.
I'm sure there's a lot of town managers who wouldn't even believe me if I told them that this conversation is happening. Listen, I do appreciate what the finance committee is saying, and I think, the thing I'll say is, we certainly, the town gave up, quite a bit over the last 2 years during the pandemic, and the school had needs that it needed the extra money because of the enrollment issue. And had I known that this conversation would take place, I think I'd be more prepared to say, well, really, we need to gain ground here, and this is what we think is a reasonable number. But I think I can point certainly to, in terms of priorities, when we presented our guideline submission, the number one priority was wages, because that's the thing that we gave up, that the workforce really gave up. And so I do like the idea of, allowing us to regain some ground on our operating budget through some allocation of this. But, I think really the town manager's budget is going to reflect what those priorities were that we submitted to you. And so I don't know what the right number is, but like I said, I do think we have deferred needs, both from a human capital standpoint and a capital expenditure standpoint, that's what we're going to be looking at.
Thank you, Stephen. Lori, do you want to make a case for the school? I'm joking.
I will if you give me a chance. It's early, right? It's early to Stephen's.
No,
We don't
this
know
is
what our
actually getting
numbers
late.
exactly are either. So.
So I've got a motion on the table. Dee, did you have a question, or what would you like to do? Because if no one else has any comment or discussion, I'd like to just take a vote on the motion and keep moving along.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
Sorry, can I say
other
one thing?
hands-
One thing before we take a vote.
Yeah.
Just keep in mind, for my coming at this, right? We're saying this $1 million. It's not 100% clear where this million is coming from, and by saying yes to this, we're guaranteeing that we have to float that million to them. When up one level, we could distribute in any way that we want to. So if we say yes to this, we have to give $1 million.
Yes.
If we wanted to give 1.2, when we just figure out our distributions, we can't do that because of this motion, correct?
Right.
Oh,
Well, yeah, that's why I was trying to understand, Greg, how much money is left over then to distribute among the three again?
Okay, yeah, so just want people to be aware of that we're tying ourselves, as opposed to if we just did it overall, we could do whatever we wanted to. And
Brian?
Yeah, no, I Greg, thank you for mentioning it. And that's kind of my fear with this. I appreciate where Dee's coming from with this, but we're fixing a number on something very early that we may not want to do.
Right.
And so maybe it might be more appropriate to move down the road here a little bit and then shelf Dee's proposal when we have a little bit more clarity around this, because I don't want to hamstring. I would be concerned if we prematurely hamstringed ourselves by doing this. So just wanted to appreciate your comment, Greg. Thanks.
Thank you.
Lois, and then we'll take a vote here.
Yeah, I just want to understand the motion because I'm actually a little bit confused about it. The principle of weighting the allocation more in favor of the town, as I said, is kind of appealing to me. I am uncomfortable with the idea of locking us into a specific number because we don't have the information. So what do we need to do tonight? Can we need to approve, I think we need to vote on a recommendation on the top line guidelines number. And I think we're coming to consensus about what that number will be. How specific do we need to be tonight about how that will be allocated among the 3 budgeting entities?
We have to be very specific.
Yep.
See those 4 cells there, the 3 cells under the blue arrow, that's the $0. We have to fill those in so that they total whatever total guideline amount we agree to. And I think we're settling at 2.491608. So we have to distribute that among those 3 cells.
Yeah.
The reason we have to distribute it like that, Lois, is because they need to be able to go back. These individual budgeting entities need to be able to go back and start working on more detail about how they're going to budget. And if we just,
No, I do understand that, but I absolutely understand that. I'm feeling a little constrained because I feel like to make that allocation, given what we've been discussing in the last half an hour or so, we don't have all of that information right now. And so any allocation we make is potentially, I think, a little arbitrary.
Well, it is to a certain extent, Lois, but remember, this is a preliminary guideline.
Yeah.
We're gonna get several things as we move closer to the budget time where a final guideline is given. We're gonna get better estimate of revenue. And as Dean said, Lori and Stephen and Jared and Carrie are gonna go prepare the budgets. And they're gonna come back with their preliminary budget showing what they've been able to do, whether they've been able to meet the guideline, go over it. We'll have another round of conversations about what can be done to come closer to the preliminary guideline, or maybe at that time we decide we want to increase the guideline. So.
Then I have one other question.
Sure.
How did we come up with $1 million? When did that number jump into the conversation?
So it jumped in because.
Would you like me to answer that?
Yeah, if that's.
Or sorry, could we move with the motion and then we could like do this discussion? Because I have a feeling where this is going to go, right?
Let's vote.
Okay, so I don't know, can we, I need a motion to cut off debate. Is that what it is? I heard two of them. Is that what I have to do formally?
No, you can ask for a vote.
Okay, I'm gonna ask for a vote on the $1 million.
Can you
So
just
to reframe.
Motion that
Sorry?
we're voting, just
Yeah.
get exactly what we're voting on.
So from what I understand, Dee made a motion to take 1 million out of the 2.491608 and give that to the town. And that's what you seconded. So that's the motion on the table. I'm gonna, can we drop the screen share for a minute so I can go around the horn here and get votes? Okay. Dee, you made the motion. How do you vote?
Yes.
Lois, you seconded. How do you vote?
Come back to me.
Chris?
No.
Ray?
Yeah, no. I mean, no, not yeah, no. No.
Brian?
No.
Mary?
No.
And Eric?
No.
Dean?
No.
And Greg?
No.
Kathy?
No.
John?
No.
And myself is a no, and Lois?
No.
Okay, so now that we've dropped that matter, let's go back to the original discussion.
And Portia, can you take $1 million off that line so that we see it?
Let's go back to the guidelines and let's focus on the well, first of all, I think there's a consensus. We start at the 2.49. Carrie, if you can pull that up for us again, please. I'd like to get him, can the chair make a motion?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna make a motion for the preliminary guideline. I can't stress that enough, especially given what Stephen said. Take the 2.491 and distribute and allocate that according to the proportions that Carrie's kindly put up in column B, which is the relative weights of the budgets, and allocate the 2.491608 that way. The reason I would say, let's just do that for now. Once the towns and the schools come back, prepare their budgets, we can then get some more information, for what Lois and others have said about, geez, where would that extra money go if we needed to give it to them? We can do it at that time, versus arbitrarily giving them $1,500,000, $700,000, $200,000 at this point. Recognizing this is all preliminary.
Second.
Okay, so now we've got a second, and we'll debate the motion. Ray, you've got a question. You're muted.
I'm confused still. Is it preliminary? So I understand that later on we can change it in some respect. And then I thought you said a few minutes ago that by giving numbers to each of the entities, we're locking it in. So I guess I would sort of mediate that and say, 500,000 extra to the town, or somewhere between 5 and 7, to respect the distinction that Dee brought up very well. I'd feel more comfortable with that than just going even, because I think that's a very good point that we've talked about, and seems to be resonate with the committee, to give the town extra, and to ignore that completely, I think, is a mistake.
Fair enough. And Ray, to be clear, when we say locking it in, we were just talking about locking it in from the perspective of the next step of allocating the rest of it today. It's
Right.
not a
I
permanent
understand.
locking.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Greg?
Thank you.
Greg, and then Brian?
Yeah, so I did want to have a discussion about where we distribute the money to. And I think by giving the motion right off the bat, we sort of hamstrung us to talking about any other numbers that we would want to float, right? So we can't even entertain Dee's idea now because we got this motion, right? So I'd like to see the committee talk about it, talk about Dee's number, because I think it's a good idea too, where we fit that in, sort of before we go putting a motion right on the table.
To Ray's point, though, Ray could formulate his comment as an amendment to this motion, and that would move the ball forward. So in other words, if we want to think about, say, adding 500K to the town, Ray could say, I want to amend this motion to take 500K off and then reallocate, and then do the allocation. So we can move there, Greg, without, getting too locked, too hamstrung.
Yeah, I got you. I see. As opposed to just having an open discussion and then doing a motion on sort of.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Brian?
Really quick, as we thought about the even weights, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about Dee's comment, but why aren't we weighting these as opposed to what was the rationale the last time? Because my sense is that why would we not? And it's a prelim number, so this is going to change. But as a starting point with respect to these budgets, especially if we're talking about making sure we're allocating equitably to the town in some form or fashion, wouldn't weighting these budget lines be more appropriate?
I believe that was the motion.
We are weighting them.
That's the motion, Brian.
But it's equally weighted.
No,
What I'm talking.
No, it's weighted. It's weighted by the size of the budgets.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Thank you. I'm done.
That's what those percentages are on column B, Brian. Okay, so Ray, you had your hand back up again. Do you want to make an amendment?
Yes. Yes, I'd like to follow up on Dean's lead and just say, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I think at least 500,000 gives a sense of so I would move that we allocate 500,000 to the town, and the rest and the balance of that funds of the 2,491,608 be allocated based on their share of the budget.
Okay, do I need a second for that
Yes, you
amendment? Is
do.
that- Okay, can I get a second?
Second,
Second.
Okay, so now let's vote on the amendment. Can we stop the screen share?
Hold on, I'd like to see the numbers that we're about to be put in.
Oh, okay, go back, go. Carrie, can you just adjust that model to reflect the motion 500,000
Thanks,
first to the
Carrie.
town and then reallocate the rest?
Screen's frozen. So it was and then well, that's not right.
No,
Yeah,
so I think the mistake was in the first calculation. So in the town one, you added in 792,
right,
which is higher than it should be.
right.
So what I would recommend is use that same share and then add 500,000 manually.
And deduct 250 from the others.
No, she did the others correct, because I think she deducted 500, 1.5. Oh, that's 1.
No.
The 792, 152 is the town's proportional share of the.
Can I make a suggestion, Carrie?
Of the
Yeah.
199,
Okay, Carrie, can I make a suggestion in cell T29?
Yeah.
Just take the 2.491 and subtract 500,000 and put in that,
Got it.
and subtract 500,000.
Oh, and
Use
then
that as the base
Right.
and allocate all of them, and then the town one add the 500,000 back in.
Right. Good.
all righty.
So just to restate, this is going to be D's option of giving to the town, but only 500,
It's gonna-
500,000 more. Okay.
Yeah, it's gonna be D's option of 500, and then she didn't make the motion, but I think to distribute the rest of it proportionally. So there you go. That's what it looks
Yep.
like.
Right.
Okay. Everybody have that? Okay. So I've got a motion on the table to make that amendment, and I've got a second. Let's now go around the room, and I'll start at the top of my screen. Lois,
Yes.
Chris,
No,
and let's see, hold on here a second here. Ray
Yes.
and Dee
Yes,
and Brian
No.
and Mary
No.
and Eric
No.
and Dean.
Yes.
Okay, Dean says yes, Eric said no. Okay, and Greg.
I'm going to say no right now.
Okay. Kathy
No.
and John,
No.
and I'm going to say no. So that motion fails by a count of 4 yeses and 2, 4, 5, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 9, 8 no's. Okay, so
Now we're back on the main motion, which is just the distribution according to the budget proportionality.
Right.
That is correct.
Do we have a second on that?
Yes.
It has
Yeah,
been
we already
seconded.
had a
Has
second.
seconded.
We already had a second.
Okay.
So Greg, you have a question or do you want to make a motion?
I have a question here too. Carrie, can you put the original up and also the 500 and also the million that we wanted to give to the town? Because to be honest, I'm flashing by these too fast and I don't have them right in front. I should have made my own in front of me.
You want to see all three of them?
If you could possibly do that quickly.
I can put a quick chart together.
Well, so Carrie, why don't you put up the model? Maybe you just do cut and paste and put them off to the side. Instead
That would
of a
work
chart.
perfect.
Just
Watch out for
paste
this.
values or something and just leave them.
Yeah,
there.
just cut and paste the values off to the side.
For partial, yours almost had it too, right?
Yeah, my number was only $30,000 off on the town side, but so cut and paste the 792 to 249. My suggestion is, and move that to where you in column C, just cut and paste it and move it to column C.
How about I just add them?
While Carrie is doing that, Parashar, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Are we still in the first meeting? Do we have to adjourn before we can vote?
Yes, we do.
Yes,
which
we
is
do.
why I gave up on my 60-minute time frame about 60 minutes ago.
So when are we going to adjourn?
I
So
hope
that we can-
soon. I hope soon. We're
Well,
almost at the
we
end.
can't, we're not supposed to vote on this in the guidelines, right?
We are. We're
Yeah.
supposed to vote it on the
Oh, we
guidelines
are.
and then go to finance and vote there.
The vote here is a
Vote
recommendation
twice.
to the full committee.
Yeah, you
Oh,
vote
it's a
twice.
recommendation. Okay, all right.
Please don't vote the other way when we get to finance.
Trick or treat, right? It's Halloween.
So I think I have these. Column D is the million to the town for tier 1. And then this is the 500.
Just to be clear, we can't say for tier 1, right? Like
That's correct.
That is correct, yeah.
Okay, Greg, is that helpful?
Very much. Thank you, Carrie.
Okay, so now let's go back, if we can, to the whole screen. See, I need to see everybody here. We have
In
a
column
motion on
K,
the
we have
table.
the straight distribution. Is that what we have there in
The
column K?
motion is now for 500,000, I think, was the yeah.
No, we-
500,000.
No,
No, that's
sorry.
voted
That
down.
got defeated. This is a straight distribution.
right.
Before, I have one question for you, Parashar, before we vote.
Just remember, Dee, we need to close the meeting.
I know, but this is, before we make some recommendation, what I'd like to know is when we get to final guidelines, if money falls out of the trees and we have other money, can we have different allocations at that point in time?
Sure.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. Having answered that question, I'm going to call for a vote. And just to be clear to everybody, the motion is to take the 2.491608 and allocate it in proportion to the total budgets for each of the units. And that would be the numbers that are in blue there, 792, 152 for the town, 1.127898 for CPS, 571, what is that, 558 for CCHS. And do I have a second? I thought I had a second.
We're on the
do.
original motion. You have a second. We're deep in here.
Yeah, okay, so let's get rid of the screen and let's go around the room. Lois
Yes.
and Chris
Yes.
and Ray
Yes.
and Dee
Yes.
and Brian
Yes.
and Mary
Yes.
and Eric,
Yes.
Dean,
Yes.
Greg,
Yes.
Kathy,
Yes.
and John.
Yes.
And Prosher, yes. Okay, the motion carries unanimously. I would like a motion to adjourn the subcommittee.
So moved.
Subcommittee.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, Lois. Chris,
Yes.
Ray,
Yes.
Dee,
Yes.
Brian,
Yes.
Mary,
Yes.
Eric,
Yes.
Dean,
Yes.
Greg,
Yes.
John,
No. I mean, yes.
Kathy,
Yes.
Kathy.
Yes, I meant yes.
Yes.
Prosher, yes. 12 yeses and 1 no.
John, you'll be here by yourself.
Okay.
All right.
John's a faithless elector.
All right, so now we're going to open up.
Jared and Lori and Carrie and Stephen, thank you very much for all of your input and information over the last 2 months, 3 months. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may, Press, I do the changes to the different approach was really helpful. So you put a lot of work into it, and I want to thank you for doing that. And it was highly productive. So have a good night.
I appreciate it. Have a good night. Chris, all yours.
Okay, so now we're going to open up the regular FinCom meeting. And I'm going to do a roll call vote to open the meeting. So Chris Reynolds, I'm present. Ray Andrews,
Present.
Parashar Patel,
Present.
Dee
Yep.
Ortner,
Present.
okay, Mary Hartman,
Here.
Dean Banfield,
Present.
Eric Dahlberg,
Present.
Greg Gariello,
Present.
Brian Taylor,
Here.
Lois Wassoff,
Present.
John Hickling,
Present.
Kathy Kukalo,
Here.
and that's all I can see on my screen. Am I missing people? I think that's everybody. So we lost a few people, it looks like. Okay. So we still have a quorum, so that's good. So on the agenda for the regular meeting, first item is minutes. We don't have minutes yet, so Kerry has hired somebody to help us with that. So I suspect we're going to start seeing minutes come in. We have nothing tonight. So the next item of business is for us to accept or hear from Parashar what the vote is of the subcommittee. And we will then vote the guidelines as a full FinCom. So Parashar, can you tell us what the vote is?
The recommendation was to provide guideline spending increase of, Carrie, correct me if I'm wrong, 2.70%. And allocate that total amount to the school, CPS and CCHS based on their total budget relative to the total budget proportion. And Carrie, if you want to put up do I have to read the numbers? Everybody saw those.
You don't. I think we're fine. So can we have, so is that a motion you're making, Parashar?
I'm making a motion to.
Right, do we have a
recommend that to the
second?
Finance Committee.
Second.
All right, so we'll do a roll call vote to accept the vote of the subcommittee. Chris Reynolds, I'm yes. Ray Andrews,
Yes.
Parashar Patel,
Yes.
Dee Ortner,
Yes.
Mary Hartman,
Yes.
Dean Banfield,
Yes.
Eric Dahlberg,
Yes.
Greg Gariello,
Yes.
Brian Taylor,
Yes.
Lois Wassoff,
Yes.
John Hickling,
Yes.
Kathy Kukalo.
Yes.
Okay, great. So that's unanimous. So we're good. We're good on that. The next item is one of the follow-ups from the brainstorming session that the select board led around ways to reduce or offset the cost of the middle school building. And one of the to-dos that the FinCom and the school committee have is to look at how we might actually affect the realization of savings associated with the consolidation of the Peabody and the Sanborn buildings. So Mary Hartman is going to take us through a proposal on that.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, just to back everybody up, when the schools came to the town in April of 2019 and asked for the 1.5 million for the feasibility study to kick off the middle school building project, they put a number of $548,000 savings per year due to some savings in utilities, some redundancies. So that was the number that was put in front of the town when we approved the 1.5 million. Last September, as Chris mentioned, the select board had a meeting to look at ways we could mitigate the impact of property taxes because of the debt service. And this came up again, and the schools agreed that yes, in fact, they would realize some operational savings. The only problem or the challenge is the mechanism to realize those savings. So the select board asked the FinCom and the school committee to go off and work together to figure out what would be the right mechanism in order to realize those savings, which again, those savings are per year. So these aren't one-time savings. These are per year savings from now until, well, as long as we'll be alive. Anyway, so Chris and I did some brainstorming, and I think we would like to make a proposal to the school committee that the mechanism we use would be similar to what we were just talking about as far as when we start the guideline process, the year the school goes live, we would simply reduce the starting budget for the schools, the CPS, by the $550,000. And that number could change, okay? But whatever the number is, as we get closer. So in other words, if the schools come in, right now they're coming in at about 40 million, that number would be reset down by the amount of the operational savings, and that would go forward. So the incremental increase from guideline spending would be based on a lower number. And we were thinking that that would be the best way, the simplest way to get those savings in the budget process, and it would continue from then on. So that's our current thinking. And Chris, does that?
I think that's right. So Mary, essentially, we do it once and then it just carries forward, right? So as long as we just have a lower baseline to start with. And I guess the one thing that would make it, or one thing that I was thinking of is, I believe now the start date for the school is kind of a mid-year. I don't think it's going to start at the beginning of any fiscal year. So it's likely that in that first year, it won't be the full 548. It would be some subset of that.
Exactly.
And then you'd have to adjust it. So we'd have to work with the school committee to make sure we've got the math right. But that's the concept.
That's the mechanics. That's the proposal for the mechanics. And the number could be higher than the 550.
Right. They haven't finished.
We don't know what the number is. What we're talking about now is what's the mechanism to realize these savings when we put together the budgets.
Okay, we've got some questions. John.
So that sounds exactly right. And I'm a little unsure what came in second in terms of an alternative. And I couldn't really think of anything. So maybe in 30 seconds, if there was an alternative to the plan that you just proposed.
Chris,
Yeah, you could make a payment, right? You could just say, give me the money, just pay it into debt service, right?
Yeah.
So instead of adjustment to the budget, you could have a lien or you could do something like that. I think this is cleaner, to be honest.
Yeah, this is cleaner. Agreed.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah.
Parashar. Where did Parashar go? Here you are.
So two questions. One is, how long would the adjustment last?
It's built into the base, so it just lowers the base the year the school consolidates. And so it's lower for, it just, you cut it out at the beginning and it just stays
Okay,
in.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then any thought to actually adjusting for inflation or anything else that would have transpired? Because presumably a lot of these savings comes from labor. And as we just heard in the discussion, labor costs grow, 4, 5, 6, 7% a year.
I
So
think
should-
most of the savings are actually utilities, Parashar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Never
So I
mind.
think it's mainly utilities. So that's kind of where it's coming from. There was some initial talk that there is headcount. So it could be, there are some categories that perhaps are duplicative. So there could be a little bit of headcount in there, but I haven't seen the details of what it is. But that's a fair question. We can certainly think about that, but.
Yeah, just think about some inflation adjustment or something.
Yeah,
You
I think,
could, but-
Chris,
ahead.
I think it was, your services, your custodial, your support services of the buildings. They felt with consolidation that they could.
Yes, there's some headcount there perhaps. Yeah.
Headcount.
Yeah.
Same thing in administration. I think they felt that they could get headcount. Certainly not teachers because they're just,
Right.
consolidating one facility. But that was my understanding.
Thank you, Kathy. Dean, and then Greg.
Yes. So my only comment here is that we, as a committee this year, we can't constrain a future committee,
Right.
but we can
That's fair.
bring this conversation up each year and remind ourselves that this is how we intend to go forward.
That's right.
We can't formally, bind ourselves in the
You're
future.
correct. You're correct. But there's been a discussion. So at the select board and with the school committee, people understand that. You're correct technically.
Yeah.
But people also have a pretty strong commitment to the, the savings that was discussed at town meeting and the fact that the people want, they want to make sure that's going to happen and they're going to hold them accountable for it. So I think that's a discussion, but that's a fair point.
Yep, that's fine. I just want to make sure everybody's clear that we can make this decision today and can't really bind ourselves to doing
Yeah.
it in the future.
You're
That's all.
right.
Yep.
Future version of you, Dean, could rescind this.
Hopefully not. Greg.
I think it was explained as the redundancies in people and stuff, but does it also take into account, hopefully it's more energy efficient, so we're not using as
Yes.
much?
I think that's the majority of the savings.
Oh,
I
as
believe the
opposed
majority of
to,
the savings is utilities.
as opposed to duplicate people and.
Correct,
services.
correct.
Thank you.
That's why the number might actually be larger than the
Right.
550.
That would be, that would be great.
So it might be larger. So we're not looking at a number right now. We're just looking again at what's the right
Right.
mechanism.
Okay.
But yeah.
I think I see another hand up. Lois.
Chris, could I just jump in?
Oh, Cynthia, sure.
So the majority of the savings right now is not utilities.
Oh, okay.
So I'm hoping that increases, but we still need to have a really good conversation about solar and where we are.
So what's the majority of the 548 now, Cynthia?
I think it's mostly personnel.
Okay.
And, some other consolidation, small numbers as far as just buses and things like that. We run buses back and forth.
Mm.
So, but we'll get it clear. We need to figure out what's going on with solar and the timeline there.
Mhm.
Because current spending, just as back of the envelope based on the budget books, is about 330 for both schools.
In electric
And heating.
and heating. Okay.
But we will be air conditioning the new building. So that's another consideration. All right. So more to come on that.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Lois, I think you had your hand up, but I don't see you
Yeah,
now.
yeah, I did. I just wanted to ask if we're ready to make a motion.
Yeah, Chris, what do you think?
Do we need, I don't know if we need one. We wanted to, this is simply, we need to take this to the school committee. So
Mhm.
I guess if we wanted to have a vote, we could say, do